with the creation of the UN General Assembly, etc., the United States is gradually creating a world state. In fact, the United States has been creating a world state for a century now, and not on their own. In fact, they're doing it somewhere as a legacy of what England did. So I'm not going to go into all that again in detail. I think it's a given since these are fairly recent programs. So I think most of the people here today have seen them. But what's interesting is this, to add another point. This construction by the United States can be related to the way in which states are usually constructed, but on a global scale. In my book on the fall of the European Empire, I devote an important chapter to the question of the emergence of the nation state, how it is formed by aggregation around a center of power, secondary centers. And what I'm saying is that, in fact, it's an imperial phenomenon, and that a nation state is not an imperial entity. A nation state is an empire that has been stable long enough, that has managed to maintain stable borders long enough, that it produces a cultural homogenization, which means that under the cage, if you like, in the mold of the state, the mold of borders and the mold of institutions, you have a nation that takes shape and then itself holds the state and is one with the state. So you have the skeleton, which is the state, and we'll say the muscle, which is the nation, and all that makes a nation state. But fundamentally, there's no real difference between imperial construction and nation-state construction. It's just that the nation-state is something, it's an empire that remains stable and lasts long enough to become homogeneous enough to constitute a nation. Examples of this are Persia, which eventually became Iran after 2,000 years, or China, which for a very long time was essentially an imperial structure, and which ended up becoming a nation when it was confronted with sufficiently powerful otherness to make it aware of its own identity, its national cultural character. The result was the beginning of the Chinese National Revolution in 2912, as I mentioned last time. And so on a global scale, the same thing is happening, because I'm telling you that it's a diffuse phenomenon, which means that it's a mechanism that works in all directions. There are simply fundamentals, ethnic, geographical fundamentals, and the size and dimensional capabilities of power. For example, something the size of a French region can impose itself on the scale of a French state, as happened historically with the Paris Basin, but not on a global scale. To impose itself on a global scale, you need something bigger, like the United States. And so in a way, a nation state the size of the classic European nation states that has succeeded in imposing itself on a global scale is the British Empire. But it was only with the emergence of the United States itself, i.e. with a larger power base, that the global empire really began to take shape. But in a way, institutionalization of the empire with the creation of the UN, with the creation of all the major international bodies by the United States, is a concretization of things that were already made possible to some extent by what we call the first globalization that took place in the British Empire. So, in any case, what we need to understand is that for all time, to the imperial monopoly, everywhere, in other words, infinity, and even every empire that is born, is the fact that this rule applies to a given era. And as for the nation state, I've told you that it applies to an era that can give rise to a nation, an era that may give rise to a nation, but it lasts long enough to give birth to a nation state. Maybe one day, and it's possible, not immediately I think, but one day, in a few hundred rather than 1,000 years, it's not impossible that the Earth itself will eventually form a nation state. But for this to be the case, I think it will really be necessary for there to have been otherness, i.e. there must have been colonies on the outside that create the otherness necessary for the constitution of the nation. So that's the first thing, the first element. So how does the USA present itself to the world, little by little? But it's the first thing that's important, because you know that in the history of state building, I've already explained this to you, the creation of a representative assembly serves to overcome the classic arrangement of separate poles of power, which in the construction of a European nation state was feudalism, since there were the great lords. And on a global scale, which I think I've already mentioned a little, is the Westphalian order, i.e. sovereign states equal among themselves, negotiating, not going to see what's going on inside other states. And the creation of the UN, first the League of Nations, then the UN under American control, is an overcoming of this Westphalian order by what I've called what is generally known as the Wilsonian Doctrine. The Wilsonian Doctrine, i.e. President Wilson's doctrine of a certain capacity for international interference in the internal affairs of states in the name of a certain number of fundamental principles, which is the equivalent, if you like, of the extension of royal justice in the Middle Ages within the fiefdoms of the great lords. That's right, it's the jurisdiction of the central power that's going to interfere in the internal affairs of the lords at the time and today of the states. What does this mean? That's why it's important for our subject, because the culmination of this movement is creation, the emergence of absolutism, of central power, based on the legitimacy it can derive from the assembly. In other words, we move away from the traditional order of respecting the powers below us, and little by little these powers themselves become nothing more than subjects of central power, of the prince in the political structure of nation states like Renaissance France. And on the scale of nations, the United States is the Prince of Nations. That's the role it finally has. Morphologically, it's the same. And so it takes this place there. And so structurally, to put it in two words, in fact, a kind of American absolute monarchy, a kind of American absolute monarchy over the concert of nations. That's the mechanics, if you like. And it's interesting because within the United States, this regime itself, to obtain the power of the United States within the United States itself, risks tending towards absolutism for a simple mechanical reason, which I describe in this book, which is that under absolute monarchy, and even before what we call classical absolute monarchy, i.e. in its construction, central power is itself based on a foundation of vassals. For example, if you take the kings of France, it was precisely this tightly knit core around the island of France where there were a few traditionally powerful vassals of the King of France, who were both his competitors in the feudal order and his supporters when it came to imposing themselves on the rest of the French territory. Take, for example, the Crusades against Qatar in my neck of the woods, led by nobles from northern France, Simon de Montfort at the forefront. But once the whole territory was conquered, the king used the competition of the lords of the conquered provinces against his own lords to put himself on the pole, if you like, and dominate the whole world. So he pitted the lords who were close and traditional to him against the new lords, the newcomers, if you like, the newly integrated. And in the end, he manages to sell something like this. The lords who come from the provincial area, they raise their status by allowing them to participate in this imperial government, but without raising them exactly to the level of his traditional feudal lords. And by putting them in competition, he succeeds in bringing them down. So he creates a kind of leveling up for the lords who come from below and a leveling down for the lords who come from above. A good example of this is during the 100 Years' War, the Burgundians and Armagnacs feud. The Burgundians supported the English, while the Armagnacs supported the King of France. And why? Because the Burgundians felt threatened by the progressive construction of royal power, by the competition from these southern lords who were coming in, joining the king's entourage like that, and who were simply in the process of taking their places. And so on a global scale, the idea is the same, i.e. that within the United States, the central power in Washington risks and is already beginning to use the power of the empire's provinces, let's say, that is to say, Europe, South America, that sort of thing, everything dominated by the United States, for the American people themselves within American democracy, who represent the Burgundians, if you like, while the others outside are the Armagnacs, if you like. There's the balance. So that's the first diagram, if you like, that we need to understand in this power struggle, is that it's tending. American imperialism itself and the American hold, American power over the world, is trying to unhook American power in Washington. The American deep state, including the CIA, tends to isolate them from the world, tends to detach them from the need to serve the American people themselves. So it becomes, if you like, a truly imperial power. And that's something that happened in Rome, and I'll come back to it, because in Rome at the end you didn't even have that many Roman empires. It was the empire. The identity was the imperial identity itself, that is to say, this kind of superior abstraction that had become detached from Rome. The famous expression, Rome is no longer in Rome, and in fact at the end Rome was no longer in Rome, since the capital itself was no longer in Rome. And the Senate had reverted to a kind of municipal administration by the end of the empire. So that's the first model to show you where leads this construction. The United States forming a world state has implications for American power at home. Power itself. First diagram. Second diagram, which gives an idea of the evolution of the United States, but in the long term, i.e. since the beginning of the history of the American state, is that of the independence revolution. Now, this is something I'm touching on a little in the structure of history, but I'm quickly putting it aside in the fall of the European empire. You have two ways of finalize a nation state, so to speak. that is to fix its borders, and to give it a government that is a representative and likely to become democratic. This could be the National Revolution movement, which you are all familiar with now. That's for states that have aged and lasted for some time, and that's fine. Independence revolutions are the other way of making nation states appear that way, so to speak. And they do so by detachment from another developing nation state that is imperial. And this happens when this nation state, when this state, which is going to make its independence revolution, this population is both culturally distant from the imperial center, distant enough to feel totally alien, to have the impression of being a colony, and geographically distant enough to be able to break away from domination. Of course, if you're on the borderline, people can always beat you up. If there are several nations between you and the parent company, so to speak, it's much more complicated. A good example of this is, of course, the United States, which everyone knows. You have Venice vis-a-vis the Byzantine Empire in the 10th century. You have Genoa vis-a-vis the Holy Roman Empire, and you have more recently Israel vis-a-vis the West, since it's basically a form of European colony. Israel, which became independent in 2548, which the Israelis call a war of liberation. And above all, an example that will interest us a great deal this evening, in addition to the Roman example, but I'll come back to that one later, is the Netherlands in the 16th century. I don't know if you've heard of the United Provinces, but they're actually the Netherlands ancestor. It was a grouping that was, by chance we might say, marriages and dynastic ties in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, which eventually became a Habsburg possession, especially the Spanish Habsburgs, via the Burgundians. I won't go into the details, especially as I don't know them all off by heart, but that's what you need to know, and that is that it was a possession of the Habsburgs of Spain at the time, in the heyday, since we're talking about the 16th century. So the 16th century is the empire on which the sun never sets. The Indies, so the Americas, etc., and so on. Indies, so the Americas, etc., except that the Dutch, and these are the Dutch, and the Dutch more generally in these Netherlands, they didn't have the same culture as the Spaniards. And then there was Protestantism to contend with. Very complex. The result was a series of wars in which is in fact a revolution for independence, in which the United Provinces, later known as the United Provinces, obtained their independence from... Can you show a 16th century map of Spain with the United Provinces? And then, interestingly enough, these provinces, there were 7 of them, had the feeling culturally of not being exactly the same thing, of being right, of having a closeness or at least an opposition to the outside world. But individually, they knew they couldn't resist because they'd be eaten up by the French in particular. And France denied them quite a bit about the Spanish Netherlands. In fact, there was to be a whole series of wars under Louis XIV after that. As a result, they decided to unite, and that's when the United Provinces came into being, similar to what the United States would become 2 centuries later. And what's very interesting is that a parliamentary system was immediately put in place, which no longer had any central power, precisely because there was the idea that the central power was the monarchy. So that was the whole point. You couldn't go back to that. That was the initial trauma. In the United States, in the early history of Rome, the detestation of monarchy is extremely important, and it's what costs Julius Caesar his life. And so what happens is that this regime is put in place, in which it's a federal state with the only institution truly common to federal states, the States General of the United Provinces, i.e. Parliament or Congress, as in the United States, states the sole central institution. And what's interesting is that it was a very strong liberal power, become liberal powers, and you have to make a distinction, and I'll just say a word about this. You have to make a distinction between independence revolution and countries that win their independence. It's not the same thing. Independence revolution is specific because it has social and political consequences that are the same as those I'm talking about, i.e. a certain vision of the political constitution that must be adopted. And so it's a country that was very free, that was very dynamic economically, notably because it brought together the entire European population who were looking for freedom of expression and so on. Descartes and Spinoza found refuge for a time in the United Provinces. And what's interesting, however, is that there remained an institution. The military position was the Stadtholder. The Stadtholder was a personage who served as head of the armed forces. So it wasn't he who was in charge of civil power, but who was, shall we say, the survival of monarchical institution, if you like. So he was the heir of the, shall we say, I don't know if it was uncatchable or something like that, or of the captain of the monarchical forces at the time. There was such a thing, quite simply because there was no king of the United Provinces who was ousted. The king was the king of Spain. And so he had a delegate who was that character, the governor, if you like, of the United Provinces. So the function remained to command What you need to know, however, is that there was normally one stadhouder for each of the United Provinces. But as Holland dominated the whole thing by mass and wealth, it was above all the Dutch stadhouder that was important. And so what happened, and this is where we're going to get interested, is how this regime aged. First, it had a phase that became very, very Republican in the 17th century. At the time of John Dovid, who was a Dutch liberal and Republican leader, who brought about the apogee of democracy. It wasn't really a democracy, it was still quite elitist, but it was the apogee of the representative regime of the United Provinces. Besides the fact that during the Dutch wars, the wars of Louis XIV Tintin I mentioned earlier, the country suffered a number of disasters. These disasters precipitated Witte's downfall and restored, if you like, a place to the military role of the stadhouder. And so, despite everything, the regime once again became very oligarchic, i.e. further removed from the parliamentary system, so it was basically the rich who ruled. But from the mid-18th century onwards, the stadhouderat once again became extremely important. Once again dominating all the provinces, and what's more, it became hereditary, i.e. the stadhouder became a monarch, simply. And so we have a monarchical mutation at the end of the history of the United Provinces. All this until during the French Revolution, the country was invaded and finally went through a kind of national revolution, but not a motu proprio national revolution, I'd like to say, of its own internal dynamics, but one provoked by the French invasion. The result was the birth of the Batavian Republic and the subsequent history of Holland. But the first interesting thing is that's what I was getting at. It's a hypothesis that I haven't quite confirmed throughout history, historionomically speaking, but on which I've been working for some time. I was obliged to leave it aside a little because I had other priorities in my research, as you know. But it's one of the other avenues I'd like to write about later. So the idea is that unlike a regime that becomes a nation state, which becomes parliamentary and then becomes democratic after a revolution, a national revolutionary movement, the best example of which is England, a regime that has done this, then remains parliamentary and democratic. Until one day, eventually, a catastrophe strikes, which was the case in France, for example, in 1942. But otherwise, as the case of England clearly shows, if the territory is not invaded, the regime is absolutely extraordinarily stable. We're talking about more than 300 years for the regime, which has evolved in the direction of democracy, of course, since the role of the central power or the royal power has continued to diminish, but its stability is indisputable. Whereas a country that has undergone a revolution of independence and has therefore been a nation state from the outset is marked by a form of representative and liberal form of government. As I said, they attracted a lot of people, probably is doomed to degenerate in the direction of absolute power. One possible reformulation could be, I hypothesize that we will return to a nation-state constitution and have a national revolution leading to a parliamentary system. And we'll have a national revolution that will lead to a parliamentary system that will remain. This is a good question, because it would mean, for example, that a Roman Empire that had survived instability would have had to end up undergoing a kind of national revolution and finally democratizing. But I can't prove it. It's just a theory at this point. Another example, besides, the United Provinces are problematic. Since the French Revolution came with an invasion, we don't know if this absolute ordre stage would have been a problem. Absolute ordre would have provoked the emergence of a national revolution through a purely internal movement. So that is something we'd like to know, but we can't absolutely deduce it from that. But there's another example, Carthage. Carthage is another country that has undergone a revolution of independence from Tyre. So it was in the 7th century BC from memory. It separated from the Phoenician mother city, of which it was a colony. It became independent. And when you look at the political institutions, they are very similar to the political institutions of Rome, for example. I'm talking about political institutions, not legal ones, because after all, the courts, political freedoms and so on, that didn't seem to be the case exactly. But we had political institutions very close to those of Rome, which in turn were close to those of the United Provinces. So it's interesting because it allows us to characterize a form of independence revolution. Now, when following Carthage's history, I don't mean in detail, you'll find it in the book on imperialist revenge, we realize that under Hannibal, in fact, from the moment of Hannibal's defeat at the end of the First Punic War, a movement of national revolution began in Carthage. Hannibal was the imperialist avenger who emerged from this national revolution in Carthage. This means that a country that has undergone an independence revolution, as it ages, can lead to a form of power absolutism that will later give rise to a national revolution. So that's interesting. Well, we're not immediately interested in the history of the United States because all we're interested in is confirming the hypothesis that on the other hand, before possibly reverting to national revolution, which I can't prove. Well, regimes that make a revolution for independence tend to pass. If we consider the duration of what we've seen in the United Provinces, which is about 2 centuries, tend to fall back on the traditional pattern of nation states with the emergence of absolute power. And why is this interesting? Because second key, the fact that the US history started with a fight for independence doesn't contradict what I said earlier about the fact that in the construction of the world state, we have a pattern that leads to absolutism. On the contrary, the internal movement of the United States itself seemed to point in that direction. Since in the institutional construction, which is on the move, it seems to have stagnated purely since independence. But that's not the case. You have a phenomenon that is fairly constant in American history, is the growing role of the US presidency. The President of the United States is increasingly important. If you take as a benchmark figures like Andrew Jackson, then Abraham Lincoln, of course, then Teddy Roosevelt, and then throughout the history of the 20th century, you have the figure of the President of the United States, to the point where increasingly the American presidential election is becoming a colossal event. And the American presidential election has become all the more of a colossal event as America has become the world's leading power. Since the American presidential election became the election watched by the whole world to find out where we were going for the next 4 years. In other words, in spirit alone, if you like, for several decades now. The idea that throughout of the international community that the President of the United States is in a way the President of the world. He doesn't rule everywhere. And yes, there are countries that reject the American order, but whether we like it or not, everyone is looking at this election a little bit like that, because everyone knows that it's going to have an impact on you, whether you like it or not. In much the same way as we used to scrutinize the royal succession, or when power was a little vacant, that was done there. And see on precisely this external domination of American power, that the president's central power was built. Andrew Jackson was a president who had played an important role in the Our War and in... What was the Our War? It wasn't the war. It wasn't just around Mexico. It was a gunfight. I can't remember. It was on the occasion of that he had won a battle in the South, which I can't remember. I haven't had time to check. Yes, in Western Mississippi, in the War of Fab. It was during the War of the War that Jackson had distinguished himself. That was the Battle of New Orleans. I don't remember the date. I wasn't sure who it was against, but it was against the English during the War of the War. So whether it was Andrew Jackson, whether it was Lincoln, who was already a form of American imperialist, even within present-day U.S. territory, but it was a reinforcement of the power of the President of the United States over the whole of America, of the President of the United States over the whole of America, rather like the Stadtholder of Holland, which gradually imposed itself over all the United Provinces. Whether it was Teddy Roosevelt, who was the first to truly project American power abroad with the Great White Fleet, with the conquest, he wasn't president yet, but the semi-conquest of Cuba, at any rate in the Spanish-American War, and then the capture of the Philippines. And then Roosevelt. What was his name? I no longer have his name. What a shame. The American president who ended the Second World War. I don't have his name anymore. I almost remember it. No. The kid with glasses. What was his name? Truman? Harry Truman? That's it. And so Roosevelt died at the end of the war. And so he died at the end of the war, I think. So as you can see that the power of the American president, especially as commander-in-chief. How do you say commander-in-chief in Latin, Leo? And why would I know that? Because it's very easy. It's imperator. Okay, so that's the word he gave. I'm stopping the show. So that's something that's extremely important. It's a word we don't use very often, but in the United States, they use it much more often, commander-in-chief. So I should have answered, how do you say to girl in Latin? I don't know that one. I never met him at Cicero's house. The guys were too polite, nor in humanist Latin. And then it's mostly in writing, the dead language side. You don't get a chance to get it out. So what was I saying? So there you have it, the power. And here we're back to the pattern I was talking about, the Armagnacs, the Burgundians, and so on. In other words, Central American power is strengthened all the more by the fact that American power has left out of the United States. Because it gives power, the importance of executive power and unbalanced in relation to the legislative power, which by its very nature is essentially a domestic power. And in the United States, no less, it's all theorized. You have the theory of the unitary executive, which became increasingly fashionable, it seems to me, from the 1960s onwards. particularly under Nixon. In any case, Nixon fully embraced the theory that the president, in fact, the idea is that everything the American president does is legal because he's the president. He has absolute power over the executive, so he can order the executive to do whatever he wants. This is because of reading of the Constitution. The section says, I think it's something like executive power should be vested in the President of the United States, that is vested in the power of the United States. So that would give him absolute totality of executive power. But on top of that, what I was telling you, and I remember telling you when I did the program on the absolute president, politics and political institutions are fundamentally very primary. It's basic social psychology, and whoever seems to have the power has the power. And so the fact that this election is so central and that the President of the United States appears to be the one who, because even in the United States, in the end, he appears to be the one through whom the United States dominates the world, since he's the one who travels, he's the one who gives the orders, etc. Congress is impersonal, so there's always the superiority of the embodied type whose name we know and can talk about, and who has garnered most of the votes for his name precisely, compared to a less powerful assembly. And so everything I said about the absolute president, about democratic standards, you see, we're mixing it all up. Everything I said in the absolute president about European democratic standards is not respected in the American Constitution. And so the American Constitution has a fundamental flaw that will prevent it from having the stability of that of the United Kingdom, for example, or in Europe, of the United Kingdom, for example, or in any case, if that of the United Kingdom has instability, it's a trend towards more democracy and the weakening of the executive, or at least the executive of the royal power. The American Constitution, on the other hand, it's like oil, it's always rising. It's the American executive. The power of the American executive is constantly increasing over the long term. And that too is an indication of the emergence of relatively absolute presidential power in the United States, and made all the more likely by the fact that among vices of the American Constitution, well, the vices, yes, the things that are unstable, let's say, and that have already begun to wobble strongly in recent years, you have election to this suffrage by the Electoral College, which is the last obstacle to absolute presidential power. I think Obama is the first, at least the first in a long time, to have been elected with an absolute majority of votes. And then there was Biden, and whatever doubts you may have about the vote itself, but let's say that's the result. And it would have been the case for Hillary Clinton if she'd been elected, but she wasn't, because there was too big a gap in the Electoral College. So what we need to see is that when Trump was elected with a minority of the votes, this was one of the major criticisms of the Not My President movement. It was seen with great criticism, with the idea that we have to get rid of this Electoral College because it's an insult to democracy, because it's not the majority who wins. However, the Electoral College's very purpose, its role, is to compensate for, to weight demography by territory. As soon as this barrier is broken, pure demography will triumph, i.e. the East and West Coasts, where immigrant populations in particular are concentrated. So these are the parts of the territory with the fastest growing populations, and the majority of whom vote Democrats. So numerically speaking, these tend to favor a swing in that direction, that way, at the expense of the American heartland, which tends to be Republican because it resists this movement. So the question is, there are two things to take from this. Firstly, as I said, the American presidency itself, elected by universal suffrage, is likely to end up imposing itself. And I've talked enough about the absolute president, about the fact that a presidency elected by universal suffrage with as much power as that gives an absolute presidency. So what's going to happen is that the destiny of American institutions is to degenerate towards absolute presidentialism, which won't mean the disappearance of Congress, of course, but it will pave the way for the plebiscitary authoritarianism of that power, and thus the exit of the United States from the democratic world. I was going to say on the same scale as what France is doing today, except that France is itself integrated into a certain number of structures, be it the European Union, where it is surrounded by true democracies, or global structures that limit the absolute power of the president. In this case, it's absolute power, i.e. the absolute power of the president, but at the head of the world's leading power, who therefore therefore reigns absolutely over the world. So it's absolutism squared, if you like, and therefore American authoritarianism will grow that way. There may be other things to criticize too, such as the role of the Supreme Court, which will probably be belittled or simply put at the president's beck and call. In any case, we can see these degenerations of American institutions coming. And all this will be combined with an evolution of the political divide within the United States. Because what we need to understand is that the reflex that we want to say, and there are many people who say it, is that now, basically, after Trump, as was said at the time, after Trump, basically a Republican president will never again be able to win elections because demographically it's lost. Now, that's not understanding how the political divide works. Convocation of another book. It's forgetting how the political divide works. By definition, if you have a side that can never win again, it's a side that no longer exists. So there's going to be a recomposition of the cleavage around other things. Do you agree? Generally, by aggregating part of the camp that always wins with the camp that always loses to create a possible alternative. And there's something else interesting here. It's that as a result, we're going to see a transformation of the political divide. Political divide with a form of synthesis. That's how it can be settled between part of the population on the east and west coasts and the population of the forgotten heartland of the United States. That is the historic population of the United States, the small ethnic whites of the central United States, so to speak, who would have to join forces with part of the population on the east and west coasts. Okay, that's political logic, and that's where we come to our third model of the evolution of the American regime, which is Patatras, Civilization B, so in comparison with Rome. History of Rome. What happened in Rome? In Rome, the imperial transformation began with the Greeks. So it actually began 50 years before the start of the civil wars. It's quite a long process. I think it will go much faster in the United States. There are three models. There are three. So this is the third one. So don't worry. It's almost over if you can hang on. I hope I've made myself clear. Anyway, if the worst comes to the worst, you can ask me questions if there's anything you've missed. So what's going on with the Greeks? The Greeks are extremely important. The Greeks are those two reformers who left an image. Sometimes you get a lot of people who like this I think there was a group recently, I think it was during Francois Hollande's time, so there was a group of anonymous socialists, anonymous executives of the Socialist Party who called themselves the Greeks, because that's what they called themselves. Greeks, because it's prestigious. The Greeks are the guys, the concern for the little people, etc., the will to reform, all that, right? So there were two Greeks. There was the elder and the younger brother. The elder was, so I always get confused. The elder was Tiberius, but that's a lie. And the youngest was Caius. That's it. Tiberius was the oldest. Now that's very interesting, the Greeks, because we often say the Greeks, you've got the Greeks who wanted agrarian reform and were killed off. Except that in reality, the Greeks, the elder and the younger, didn't want to do the same thing. And I think that's something I'd already mentioned a little while ago, so I don't think I mentioned it in Leosynth. In fact, there was one who was right-wing and one who was left-wing. One was even reactionary and the other revolutionary. And here we have this little centrism by extreme addition. In other words, what Tiberius wanted was, he saw the state of Roman society. He saw that the Roman Empire, the constitution of the Roman Empire, was still under the Republic. But then they'd already conquered all of Greece, most of Spain, part of the Middle East, Africa. Well, it was a big area. And the senatorial elites were getting enormously rich. The consuls brought out the senatorial elites. And so, effect, economic senators captured land. We'll talk more about this when we do the program Rome, semi-liberalism, socialism, but I'll keep it short. The senators captured part of the land that had been conquered and annexed to what was known as the War Publicus, i.e. the public domain. They appropriated it even though it was forbidden. And they put slaves on them en masse in what is known as the latifundiary mode of exploitation. That is quite simply the vast estates, i.e. the large properties, and they put slaves on them who were also taken during the wars. That's how they exploited it. The profitability may not have been great, but since you had a lot of land with a lot of cheap labor on it, you could produce very cheaply and ruin the small Roman landowners who were doing the work. The small Roman landowners who made up Rome's traditional social body, since Rome's traditional social body, Rome's model was the citizen soldier, a small landowner who served in the army and defended the freedom of the city, except that the Roman model had become these little citizen soldiers who were sent to be killed off for the benefit of the Senate, which in turn scraped up the land and exploited it, ruining the little peasant soldier. So it's very funny. If you know this sequence, I think you know it. From Will Hunting, the character was explaining, do you know it, Leo, this sequence? Is it the one at the NSA? Right, where he was at the NSA, where they wanted to hire him at the NSA, because I remind you, he's a little genius, Will Hunting, and he explains, basically, you'll see the clip again, that I'll have a buddy who, I'm going to go and work for the NSA to justify a war in some place, so that they'll send my buddy who, to pay for his studies, went into the army, and then he'll go and shoot himself in the butt in this foreign country. He'll come back here, they'll give him 3 bits if they give him something as a veteran, and he'll end up on the street, because the job he would have had here on the way over, they gave to the guy he went to shoot in the country. Well, if you like, this description works well because it says something. It doesn't say everything, but it says something about American imperialism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Well, it's typically what I've just told you about what was happening to Roman imperialism and for the fate of the Romans, of the Roman people in the 1st century BC. So for back to Tiberius Gracchus, he sees this and he says, we need land reform. We've got to go back to the way Rome was before. Reactionary. You have to go back to the Rome of the past. What was the Rome of the past? It was small citizen soldiers, small landowners, a middle class, defending their country, but for something else. So the land had to be redistributed to the small Roman citizens in a heap of small properties, and not a few very large properties for the benefit of the rich in the Senate. That's what Tiberius Gracchus wanted. The Senate schemed to put a corrupt candidate in front of him, Livius Drusus, and Tiberius contested the election. There were riots, and Tiberius Gracchus ended up dead. Well, Trump didn't end up killed, but I think you can see the pattern of the guy who comes to explain Yanamar remaking America great by relying on the little people and not the big multinationals that get rich. Multinationals that are getting rich on the outside and so on. It's exactly the same thing. Tiberius Gracchus and Trump, right? But then it was a reactionary vision of things because it was about redistributing land to the Roman citizens of Rome, not to the Italians, right? Not to the whole of Italy, which the Romans had federated around themselves and which also provided contingents for the war. No, it was a question of re-establishing Rome and the traditional Roman regime for Tiberius Gracchus. 10 years later, you have his brother Caius Gracchus, who has a completely different vision, i.e. he too brings his reform to the war. Don't you agree? That's why we often equate the two when they're not at all the same thing, even if one is a continuation of the other after all. Caius Gracchus, he says, he saw that Tiberius' battle was lost because he had the Senate against him and all, it wasn't possible. On the other hand, he said, we must carry out an agrarian reform for the benefit of all the poor of Italy, all Italian citizens. What's more, they should be given Roman citizenship. They must all be Romans and redistribute the land among them all to make a great Roman republic, like a neo-Roman republic, but on the scale of the whole of Italy. In other words, the republic as before, but bigger and better on the scale of Italy. This is extremely important because you can see the change, which is that, as he understood, that Tiberius's battle was lost because in the end, the Romans no longer carried enough weight. He said to himself, on the other hand, if I appeal to the entire population of Italy, that's an electoral mass, let's say, that's much larger, so it carries more weight. Caius Gracchus didn't get his way, his coup, but 20 years later, because Caius was 110, I believe, the other was 133. No, it's 121. Yeah, it's 121. So 30 years later, that's it. That's 90 BC. You've got the start of the social war. And the social war is a war in which, very much like the American Civil War, Rome wins, since the Allies, in fact, the states federated around Rome, the other Italian cities federated around Rome, were defeated militarily, but Rome lost politically, since it was obliged to grant Roman citizenship to all the inhabitants of Italy. So there will be no agrarian reform, but just after that, as from then on, the Roman people would be the entire population of Italy, the camp of the populares. That is, the people who rely on the people against the optimates, i.e. essentially the Senate and their clients, became significantly demographically more important, and that's when the civil wars begin, which are revolutionary wars. I won't be able to go into the details. I think we'll talk about them in the program on Rome. There are several things that overlap. To obtain redistribution from Roman citizens. From the plebs, you have above all the will of what was called the equestrian order. The equestrian order, if you like, that was the class Roman elites just below the senatorial class. It was less richer per capita. I think it was half as much or 4 times as much. I don't know. It was 500,000 sesterces versus 2 million, I think, something like that, but much more numerous. So it must have been 4 or 5 times more numerous, but less wealthy. But it was the underclass on which the Senate also relied, because for a long time this class assimilated itself to the Senate and wanted to join it. But in reality, the equestrian order at one point wanted to overthrow the Senate. And to a large extent, the emergence of the empire was the overthrow of the senatorial class by the equestrian class, since the equestrian classes were to become the main supporters of the imperial regime, while the Senate will always be on the chopping block and will continue to lose power until the end of the Roman Empire. So why is this interesting? It's because it shows you the path that this political mutation and the internal political struggle in the United States must take. Since with Trump we were at the Tiberius Gracchus stage, this means we're going to see a transformation of the political divide, where Trumpism, which was a bit reactionary, is going to become revolutionary. So I'd already mentioned it, but because for me it was significant, and I've been quoting it 4 or 5 times now, excuse me if I keiger a little on this, but it's important to illustrate when you have a good illustration. At the time of the story, I can't remember the name of the company, this thing that a sort of pension fund had bet against, some kind of pension fund. I always forget the name. GameStop. Well, GameStop, and you've got a whole bunch of very small holders who came to the rescue of the thing and almost caused the fund to plunge until the listing was stopped by the authorities and so on. All in all. So pure crony capitalism, when in fact he'd ended up with his finger in the door, and the small investors who'd pulled off the stunt could have made good money. But it sent out a signal that yes, if you don't have the political inconsistencies, the market has its limits. And what's very interesting is that on Twitter there was a convergence between Trump's son, what's his first name again? Yes, but which is LeBron? There's Eric and Don and Donald Jr. I think it was Don Jr., yeah. Donald Trump Jr. and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so the far-left Democratic Jerrys, who had agreed that it was a scandal that the small stockholders were being taken advantage of. And when I saw that, it's the same, you know, with those who pull the rope. That's it, yes, that's it. And when I saw that, and that's why I've said it before and I repeat it every time, because for me, you know, it's a weak signal. Weak signals are a trick. It's thanks to the model that you spot them. It's because you have a model that you know it could be important. And so I said weak signal of the political mutation that's about to happen, maybe not in the election of 2000 election, but it's going to happen. In any case, in 2022, no, it hasn't happened yet, but I think it's going to happen. In other words, out of detestation of the Washington elites, the regime largely corrupt, because with the Hunter Biden stories, I'm not talking about them because I don't know the details of the file, but I do know that there are things that come out and things that are vague, etc. And even the voting story, I'm not talking about it because I don't know the details of the file. And even the history of the vote, there was no fraud, let's say in the authentic sense of the term, but in fact, there were maneuvers that can be likened to fraud with the use of a certain number of voting systems that should not have been validated and so on, in a nutshell. So we can play on words and say that it's not fraud, but in any case, it's to do it to please him. There would still be something to say, as Audiard would have said. And so all the people who honor this system will gather in both the immigrant and working classes, and in the working classes. So there can be a kind of synthesis, a kind of equality and reconciliation, if you like. Equality and reconciliation, if you like, between these categories in the United States. That's because that's what we saw in Rome. That's what we saw in Rome. And so after Tiberius Trump, we should have a Caius Trump. It could be Don Jr., it could be him, I don't know, or it could be someone else. But in any case, the phenomenon, I think, is heading that way. And in any case, it's a harbinger of imperial mutation in the future, as it was in Rome. It's heading in that direction. So the third model too points in this direction and suggests that for the time being, this is how this mutation will take place. This evolution towards the plebiscitary regime, which also corresponds to the fact that an increasing proportion of the American population is of Latin American origin, since that's where the big waves of immigration come from. The political culture of the plebiscite remains extremely strong in Latin America. In other words, it's a traditional reference point, and political culture, I don't have time to go into that too, but it's extremely important. I think I've already mentioned the fact that the big difference between Rome and Carthage is that Rome came from Phoenician civilization, and at the time when Carthage came from Phoenician civilization, and at the time when Carthage broke away from Phoenician civilization hadn't reached the stage of the equivalent, let's say, of parliamentary rule. When Rome arrived, made its independence revolution, while Athens was already The Romans, it's well known, sent emissaries, at least that's what their history says, to draw up the 12 tables in order to imitate isonomy, i.e. the equality of rights invented by the Greeks. But when the Carthaginians launched their independence revolution, they had no cultural referent who had also invented this isonomy, so it escaped them. This also explains why Carthage never became a regime. Carthage simply didn't invent the law, unlike Rome. So this cultural aspect, also imported from Latin America, also goes in the direction of strengthening once again central power. And the whole cast around Biden, the business circles, the whole idea, you know, these elites who don't give a damn but who surf on the whole woke ideology, whether it's the big multinationals, GAFA, the democratic elites, all that, it's pretty typical of optimates, in fact. In other words, the Roman senatorial oligarchy and its political clientele. So we find the same model. And then you have the populares who will exist, who will rise up and end up taking power under a plebiscitary regime, because that's what they want. And it's quite possible that this will happen, that this will lead a new civil war. As you know, in Rome, there were 30 years of civil war with ups and downs. There was civil war, then it calmed down, then there was civil war, then it calmed down. But it's perfectly possible to get into this kind of situation. And then to finish on this point, how do we articulate this? Because at the moment, I'm doing some summary shows to try and tie everything together. I do them regularly. How can we link this with what I've told you about the war in Europe, Putin's advance, the dynamic proxy war, etc.? Well, it brings us closer, actually. And this will please my friend Hugo. It brings us closer to what the Mithridates Wars were. Mithridates was the king of the bridge. The bridge basically went around the Black Sea, so the north of Turkey, the north coast of Turkey, the Crimea, all that. Mithridates was king of the bridge, and Mithridates was an enemy of Rome, who at one time, in fact, in the first Mithridatic War, which took place at the same time with the first Roman Civil War, Mithridates saw that the Romans were starting to beat the crap out of each other with Marius and Sylla, and he thought, this opens up an extraordinary space for me. And so he thought, I'm going to liberate the Greek cities in particular. And that's how Mithridates, in the Cultipedia article on Mithridates, we have a map of Mithridates' advance during the First Mithridatic War. It's important to note that this advance wasn't achieved so much by military success, because Mithridates didn't have much military success against Rome, in fact. His wars didn't go very well. On the other hand, he had some absolutely extraordinary political successes, since he managed to move forward and raise up a large part of Greece, which claimed to have its back to Roman domination. And this was possible precisely because Rome itself was sinking into civil war. That's why Mithridates was so successful. Did you find the map or not? Because I've got the return, I just can't see it yet. And yeah, that's the one. So that gives you an idea of the extraordinary progress, because people were starting to get restless in Greece too. Right, and so the guy had already taken practically the entire Anatolian coast. That's extraordinary. And so a victory in the dynamic proxy war of the kind, well, a victory, not a final victory once again, since Mithridates also lost it in the end, and quite badly. He ended up committing suicide, Mithridates, but a strategic victory for Putin, as well as the collapse of the European Union, although we're doing the book for the details of why it's going to collapse internally. But on top of that, with war, therefore, a collapse of the European Union, and thus a Europe descending into civil war could also, if it happens in 2 or 3 years' time, be concomitant at least with the start of the first episodes of civil war in the United States. In that case, we'd be in a pattern quite similar to that of the time of the Mithridatic Wars for Rome. So there you have it. I think that compared to what's happening in Europe, the United States is at a more advanced stage in its internal dynamics than Europe. More advanced in their internal dynamics than Rome was. Because if we keep the example I'm taking in general, which is that of Persia and Macedonia, in terms of the internal dynamics of Europe, well, in this contemporaneity, that's when it corresponds. Well, that was before the Greeks in Rome. So today we're between the two Greeks, let's say, in the United States. But as things speed up, maybe civil war will come much faster too. There you go. And if not, in any case, it's not at all impossible that civil war will come just after the war has been won. That is, if, like, the United States wins the war in China against Russia too, so they triumph on a global scale, and at that point they're on their own again. And these are also situations that can give way to quite a few civil wars, because when there's no longer any external danger, people tend to go back to beating each other up inside. But there you have it. What I've tried to explain, and I hope hope I've made myself clear, is that all this historionomic reasoning converges towards the mutation of the plebiscitary of the American Republic. And if there are also episodes of civil war, it will tend to settle more and more into a military dictatorship, which is often the prerogative, or at least the accessory, the corollary of plebiscitary regimes, especially if we're imitating the great military dictatorships of South America, from Simon Bolivar to Santa Anna. I wanted to tell you about this. American imperial mutation is getting closer and closer.